Somewhere above 10,000 feet, where the air is too thin to hold a normal conversation without gasping, men once built entire towns out of nothing but desperation and the promise of gold. They hauled sawmills up cliff faces on the backs of mules. They dug tunnels into rock so cold it could freeze the sweat on their backs mid-swing. And when winter closed the only road out, they were trapped, sometimes for 6 months at a time, with no doctor, no mail, and no way home. Some of them never left. Not because they didn't want to. Because the mountain wouldn't let them. This is the story of what it actually meant to live inside a remote mountain mining camp, not the romanticized version with a lone prospector panning a quiet stream, but the real one, overcrowded, filthy, dangerous, occasionally lawless, and yet somehow one of the most tightly bound communities in American history. To understand these camps is to understand a particular kind of gamble, one where men bet their bodies, their sanity, and sometimes their lives on the idea that a mountain might make them rich. By the middle of the 19th century, the discovery of gold and silver in the American West had triggered one of the largest voluntary human migrations the country had ever seen. California in 1848. Colorado a decade later. Nevada's Comstock Lode not long after that. Word of a strike could empty a town overnight. Farmers put down their plows. Clerks walked out of banks. Soldiers deserted their posts. All of them chasing the same rumor, that somewhere in the folds of a mountain range, the earth was practically bleeding precious metal. But here is the detail most people never stop to think about: the richest deposits weren't sitting in gentle valleys. They were buried high in the Rockies, the Sierra Nevada, and other ranges where the terrain itself seemed designed to keep people out. Steep grades. Thin oxygen. Snowfall measured in feet, not inches. To reach the ore, prospectors had to go where almost nothing else could survive, and then build a functioning town there, from scratch, usually within a matter of weeks. That speed is almost impossible to picture today. A camp could go from a handful of tents to several thousand residents in a single season. Places like Leadville, Colorado, sitting above 10,000 feet, ballooned from a rough cluster of prospectors into one of the largest cities in the state, complete with saloons, an opera house, and eventually electric lighting, all while surrounded by nothing but wilderness and altitude sickness. The speed wasn't a sign of comfort. It was a sign of urgency. Everyone understood that a strike could run dry just as fast as it had opened, and nobody wanted to be the last one still digging when the gold ran out. So what did a day actually look like for the men living in these places? It began before sunrise, often in darkness, because daylight in a mountain camp was a precious and limited resource, swallowed early by the surrounding peaks and returned late. Miners would eat a hurried breakfast, usually something heavy and cheap: salt pork, beans, hard bread, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. Then they'd descend into the mine itself, sometimes climbing down ladders bolted into shafts that dropped hundreds of feet into total darkness. Inside, the work was brutal in a way that's hard to overstate. Miners swung picks and sledgehammers against solid rock for 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours at a stretch. The air underground was thick with dust that settled permanently into their lungs, a slow, invisible killer that many wouldn't understand the danger of for decades. Cave-ins were a constant threat. Support timbers, hand-cut and often improperly braced in the rush to keep extracting ore, could give way without warning. Explosions from black powder, and later dynamite, killed miners with grim regularity. Historians estimate that mining was among the deadliest occupations in the 19th century American West, with fatality rates far exceeding almost any other trade of the era. And when the shift ended, there was no easy relief waiting outside. The camps themselves were often just as dangerous as the mines. Sanitation was minimal to non-existent. Waste ran through open ditches alongside footpaths. Clean water was scarce, and outbreaks of typhoid, dysentery, and cholera could sweep through a camp in days, killing more men in a single bad month than a mine collapse might in a year. Doctors, when they existed at all, were often untrained opportunists who had followed the gold rush themselves, offering remedies that ranged from questionable to outright dangerous. Now picture all of that happening not in a mild climate, but at altitudes where a summer afternoon could turn into a snowstorm within hours. Mountain weather doesn't follow polite rules. Camps positioned above the tree line faced blizzards that could bury entire streets, avalanches that could wipe out bunkhouses built too close to a slope, and cold so severe that frostbite was simply an accepted cost of doing business. Some camps became completely cut off from the outside world for months once the first heavy snows arrived, their only road buried under drifts taller than a man. Supplies had to be stockpiled in advance, because once winter set in, nothing was coming up that mountain, and nothing was going down it either. This isolation created a strange psychological pressure that's easy to overlook. These weren't men choosing solitude in a cabin by a lake. They were crammed together, sometimes 20 to a bunkhouse, with no privacy, no way to contact family, and no guarantee they'd survive the season. Loneliness and claustrophobia hit at the same time, in the same room. Diaries and letters from the period, preserved in state historical archives, describe men going weeks without speaking to anyone outside their immediate work crew, watching the same faces across a mess hall table night after night until the isolation itself became its own kind of hardship. And yet, somehow, out of that pressure came community. It had to. Survival demanded it. Miners who might have been strangers a month earlier became each other's only lifeline, sharing food when supply wagons were delayed, pulling each other out of collapsed shafts, nursing one another through fevers with nothing but whiskey and hope. Camps developed their own informal codes of conduct, their own rough justice systems, because there was often no actual law enforcement for miles. Disputes over claims, who had the right to dig where, could turn violent fast, and in the earliest days before formal government reached these remote settlements, miners often organized their own courts, electing judges from among themselves and settling disputes through makeshift trials held in the open air. It's worth pausing here on something that surprises a lot of people. These camps were far more diverse than the popular image of the lone white prospector suggests. Chinese immigrants made up a significant portion of the mining workforce in many Western camps, often relegated to the most dangerous or least profitable claims due to discriminatory laws and social hostility, yet building their own tight-knit communities within or alongside the larger camp. Mexican and Latin American miners, many of whom brought with them centuries of accumulated mining expertise from Spanish colonial operations, were often the ones teaching newly arrived Americans techniques for extracting and processing ore. African American miners, some of them formerly enslaved people seeking a new life in the West, also worked these claims, facing their own set of hardships and exclusions. The camps, in other words, were not the homogeneous frontier fantasy often portrayed on screen. They were chaotic, multicultural, and full of tension, cooperation, and everything in between. As camps grew from rough tent cities into something resembling permanent towns, a strange kind of infrastructure sprang up almost overnight. Saloons were usually the first proper buildings, because alcohol was one of the few reliable comforts available and because saloon owners understood there was money to be made from exhausted, isolated men with cash in their pockets. Gambling halls followed close behind. So did brothels, which in many camps operated with an openness that would have been unthinkable back east, simply because the normal social structures that might have discouraged such businesses hadn't caught up to the frontier yet. But alongside the vice came genuine attempts at civilization. Churches were built, often by the same rough hands that dug the mines, because faith mattered to many of these men in a place where death could arrive without warning. Schools appeared once families started following the miners west, as camps stabilized enough for women and children to make the journey. Newspapers sprang up in camps that seemed to have no business supporting one, because information, about new strikes, about supply routes, about the outside world, was almost as valuable as the ore itself. The economics of these camps were as volatile as the mountains they sat on. A single camp could go from boomtown to ghost town in the space of a few years, sometimes a few months. When a vein of ore ran dry, or when a bigger strike was discovered somewhere else, the entire population could simply vanish, leaving behind buildings that stood empty for decades, slowly collapsing under the weight of snow they were never quite built to withstand. Historians and preservationists have documented hundreds of these abandoned mining settlements scattered across the mountain west, some so remote and so thoroughly forgotten that hikers still occasionally stumble across the remains of buildings, machinery, and personal belongings left behind in a sudden rush to leave. There's something haunting about that pattern, the speed of arrival matched by an equally sudden departure. It tells you something about what these places really were. Not homes, in the traditional sense. Not even really towns, in the way we think of towns today. They were bets. Living, breathing wagers on a piece of mountain, occupied only as long as the gamble seemed worth continuing. And yet, for the people who lived through it, the experience left a mark that outlasted the camps themselves. Letters and journals from former miners, collected in state archives and historical societies across Colorado, California, and Nevada, reveal a strange nostalgia even among men who had suffered enormously in these places. They wrote about the specific quality of mountain light at dawn before a shift began. They wrote about friendships forged in conditions that no ordinary workplace could replicate, bonds built from shared danger, shared cold, shared hunger. Some described the camps as the hardest years of their lives. Others, almost in the same breath, described them as the years they felt most alive. Modern mining operations, of course, look almost nothing like this today. Advances in engineering, safety regulation, and technology have transformed remote extraction into a far more controlled and monitored industry. Contemporary mountain mining camps, the ones that still exist in places like northern Canada, remote parts of South America, or high-altitude sites in Central Asia, bear little resemblance to their 19th-century predecessors in terms of safety standards or living conditions. Workers today typically rotate in and out on fixed schedules, flown in and out by helicopter or small aircraft, with heated barracks, satellite communication, and regulated shift limits that would have seemed like unimaginable luxuries to a miner in 1880. But the fundamental challenge, the isolation, the psychological weight of being cut off from ordinary life for extended stretches, the physical toll of working at altitude in harsh weather, hasn't disappeared entirely. Modern camp workers still report the same core difficulties their predecessors faced, the strain of separation from family, the particular exhaustion of high-altitude labor, the way weeks in a remote camp can distort a person's sense of time. It's a reminder that no matter how much technology changes the details, some parts of the mountain mining experience appear to be built into the nature of the work itself. What's left of the original camps today is mostly silence. Wind moving through the empty frames of buildings that once held hundreds of exhausted, hopeful, terrified men. Rusted machinery half buried in scree. In some places, entire main streets still stand, preserved either by historical societies or simply by the dry mountain air that slows decay. Visitors who make the trek to these ghost towns often describe an eerie stillness, the sense that something enormous once happened here, and then, just as suddenly, stopped. Maybe that's the real story of the remote mountain mining camp. Not a tale about gold, exactly, though gold was always the reason. It's a story about what people are willing to endure, cold, danger, isolation, loneliness, when they believe the mountain in front of them might change their lives. Some of them were right. Most of them weren't. But for a few astonishing decades, thousands of ordinary people climbed into some of the harshest terrain on the continent and built something resembling a life there, out of nothing but nerve and necessity. If you had lived in one of these camps, with the isolation, the danger, and the constant uncertainty of whether the gold would ever pay off, do you think you would have stayed through the winter, or packed up and walked back down the mountain the moment things got hard?